Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. Lando Norris on pole for the sprint race in Qatar tomorrow in a similar McLaren performance to what we saw around this circuit last year. Ferrari very disappointing in the end. Lewis Hamilton not happy with his Mercedes, but again there's one man under the spotlight. Red Bull family's performance this weekend. Lawson, Tsunoda looking quick at times. Verstappen still qualifies well. Sergio Perez once again nowhere to be seen. Very much intriguing your thoughts in the comment section below. How can this man possibly maintain that Red Bull seat next year? Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. We still have technically a three-way fight for the Constructors' Championship, but of course we all know there's only potentially two winners of that as it stands this season. I just wanted to give an update as well on another remarkable story coming out of the FIA. So yesterday we talked about two more senior members. There have been, I think now 10 this year that have been fired basically or let go by the FIA. Two more departed over the last couple of days, a race director and one of their top stewards in Tim Mayer. Now there's two more people removed, and this is like, you honestly couldn't make this stuff up. The Times does an article on it. I'm not paying for that. If you guys have or want to, feel free. I'll link it down below. This is a quote from the article. So in February, the committee received information from the finance department that asked questions about the administration of funds allocated for the president's expenses and the absence of receipts. That started well. The president's expense fund is referred to by FIA lawyers as his entitlement. So Ben Sulayem has a certain amount of money he's allowed to basically spend each year, and apparently the later email to the International Motoring Club suggests the entitlement was $1.5 million. So, okay, whether that's fair or not, it's up for you to decide. The Finance Committee was led to believe that Ben Sulayem was intending to spend a proportion of the entitlement on the maintenance of his private jet. So, sounds like perfectly reasonable spend of money to me. In the FIA statute and regulations, there is no record of how the president's entitlement should be administered and whether or not it can be spent on private jet maintenance. The president is unsalaried. The FIA has not disclosed how much of Ben Sulayem's entitlement was spent in his first 2 years in office. The two members they've let go of are members of the committee that scrutinises its finances. So, as I say, you're going to make this stuff up. Seems like Ben Sulayem has been, I don't know, doing questionable things. And again, this is the question, right? Because I guess his presidency is up for renewal, so he needs to keep the right people happy so that he gets voted to be the president again, which from an outside perspective looking in seems unlikely, but you just never know. So he's got a $1.5 million funds, you know, sloshing about somewhere, and he doesn't know how to spend it, maybe on his private jet or something, and then two of the individuals that are meant to be looking after that and making sure that he's doing with that money what should be done with that money have now been fired. So, you know, I'm not going to say any more than that. We're going to talk about Perez in a second. I did think his comments were interesting, to say the least, going into the day. He says, there's a reason why we extended my contract during the year. The team has everything they need to know. The reason is money, let's be honest, right? You know, the sponsorship dough that comes in for many of the sponsors that Perez has or maybe had, there are questions whether that's going to continue going into the new season based on his and Red Bull's performance. He says, when asked if he could say with 100% confidence that he'll be driving with Red Bull next year, he replied, yes, exactly. So, do you believe it? I'm not so sure. Even Jos Verstappen, I thought, was somewhat surprising, talked about Perez and says, if Red Bull builds a car that is neutral, that everyone can get along with, then I think Checo will be there at the front again, which was a fascinating comment, I thought, because, you know, usually Jos Verstappen has not been giving any praise to Perez, really. And also, Jos is kind of admitting that the car is, you know, designed for Max, or certainly designed in a way that Max prefers to what Checo prefers. But Jos is like, yeah, if they build a car that's more neutral, then Perez is going to be fine, which kind of implies to me that Jos wants Perez to stay as Max's teammate, which is interesting because he's not helping him at all, but equally he poses no challenge. And if there was, you know, a Tsunoda or a Sainz or something in the car, then it might get a little bit more interesting. But intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Tsunoda even talked about this. Now, he didn't have a great day today, although I think he did get caught out by traffic and conditions in sprint qualifying. Very tricky session to get right, and Yuki will be annoyed that he couldn't show in sprint quali the kind of good pace that he showed in practice earlier in the day. But he has driven the RB20 in the simulator lately and actually said this. Now, of course, this is what he is going to say, but I thought it was funny, really. The amount of speed you can carry into a corner, and it's quite sharp turning compared to our car, but it feels great, you know. Normally, simulator work is more like work, right? But when I was driving, I felt a bit of an enjoyable feeling. I don't think, at least so far, what I experienced in the simulator, it's a car that won't suit me. I think actually the car suits me well. So yeah, it's pretty good. So I think it's funny how blatant this is from Yuki. Whether he's telling the truth or not, like, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but I still thought it was funny that, I mean, what's Yuki going to say? He's driven the RB20 in the sim. Obviously, he's going to tell the media, but therefore also Horner, Marco, Verstappen, whoever, Perez, that yeah, it's a car that suits me. I could do a good job in this car. That's the implication. Whether Tsunoda actually had those feelings in the sim, whether he can back those feelings up when he's in the car at the post-Abu Dhabi test at the end of the season, that is another question. And Yuki was also kind of responding to people that were saying, why are you not getting considered? And basically Yuki said, I don't really know. Maybe something's changed lately. Dynamics have changed after Matishit's passed away. I don't know, he says. And he actually, I think, spoke to the race and said, can you ask Red Bull? Like, can you ask Horner what the situation is? Because often Red Bull will say, oh, well, you know, we're keeping all our options open. And Horner then responded to that question and pretty much said, well, Perez, you know, it really depends on what happens with him, but Yuki's certainly in the ballpark. Of course, they're going to say that. They're not going to make their decision, it seems, for a little bit of time. But let's talk about practice and what eventually happened in Quali. This was interesting this weekend. So Ferrari, their car, I don't think on paper should have been as good around here as the McLaren was, for example. I thought the McLaren would be the stronger machinery this weekend. It's looking that way so far. But Leclerc was unbelievable in the practice session earlier in the day. And part of that seemed to be due to this new experimental floor. So they've got a new floor update they've brought to the car to try and help them win the Constructors' Championship, although that's looking a tall order, it's got to be said, after today. Leclerc used this for practice, and it's an interesting weekend to try it on if you're Ferrari, because it's a sprint weekend. You have 1 hour of practice before you're, set up for qualifying, which is very difficult to make that work. But that's what Ferrari tried to do. That's what they attempted, and it worked out rather well. Lando was pissing a few people off as well during the practice session. I thought it was kind of funny because, well, it was getting in people's way. To be fair, Qatar is a fast track, and there aren't too many places to let people by. It's a phenomenal track to watch qualifying on, it's got to be said. But yeah, Norris was getting in people's way. Leclerc says, I don't know what this guy is doing, and then proceeded to put in some banger laps. So this was a few minutes to go in the session. Leclerc was 8 tenths up on anyone, put in a banger lap, and then he put in another banger lap just after this, I think to go into the 121s. We'll actually look at the numbers here in a second. But yeah, it was all over the place. But as you guys can see already, Verstappen was 4th at this point. Perez was down in 16th. And I know that Bernie Collins went through this on the broadcast. It's not like Perez was, in the mix for 2 sectors and then made a big mistake. He was just slow in every sector, and that was not going to change. This I thought was interesting as well, just to look at here, that since the summer break, Max has absolutely been beatable. He scored 126 points in that time frame. Leclerc has scored the most at 142, then Lando at 141. But obviously, that points gap has not been enough for Lando to try and win the championship. That's now signed, sealed, delivered for Max, and maybe in another universe, Leclerc could have even been in the conversation to win this year's championship as well. But there is still one championship still up for grabs. Ferrari, at this point, were looking pretty good for it, because Leclerc had just smashed everyone out of the park in the practice session, and they're looking for another Constructors' win for the first time in a very long time. But it's the same story for McLaren as well. Somehow Stroll was P2 for a time, although that never looked likely to last. You also never really know what the fuel loads are going to be in these sessions. And we've got to talk about Mercedes, because they, well, again, it was Hamilton struggling today in large part. Russell, it was similar to what we've seen over the last few weekends, really, when, Hamilton clearly not as comfortable in this car as Russell is, whether that's, driving style related or different setup related or whatever, right? We don't really know. And we've kind of seen this lately at Alpine, where despite Ocon and Gasly being basically neck and neck for their entire time at Alpine, now Ocon's about to be gone out the door. All of a sudden, Gasly's, made serious inroads and is now substantially faster than Ocon seemingly every weekend, which doesn't really seem valid. And we're seeing the same thing at Mercedes. There's got to be something in that Hamilton or Russell, I don't exactly know what's going on, but it definitely feels like, anyway, that with Hamilton coming to the end of his time at Mercedes, his gap to Russell in qualifying has opened up somewhat. And in FP1, the Mercedes were back to being a second off the pace. So Merc were talking big going into the weekends. Yeah, we're going to be really strong, just like we were in Vegas. And to be fair, Russell put on a great quali lap. I don't know what it's going to look like in terms of long run pace. I'm not so convinced on that one. But yeah, Hamilton wasn't happy with the handling of the car. He actually called it a rock over the radio, which I thought was pretty funny. I guess talking about the suspension really, because it is a challenging car to drive at the best of times, that Mercedes. Well, apart from in Las Vegas when it was the best that it ever was, inexplicably out of nowhere. Slightly high temperatures here in Qatar this weekend. The track is very, very smooth though, so you can run the car incredibly low to the ground. To do that though, you've got to run very stiff suspension settings, probably not exactly the same that was used back in Las Vegas. So yeah, Hamilton's not so happy about that, and after practice he wasn't a particularly happy man either. But after practice concluded, we did have some long run data to briefly look at. It's just impossible to read anything into this really, just because of the length of stint, and also on a weekend like this, who is using race fuel, who is using sprint fuel, you just don't really know the answers. But yeah, Verstappen's lap times were kind of all over the place really, but then again, traffic is everywhere around Qatar because there's just not so many places to overtake, because there's just so many corners happening all the time, and often those corners are a bit scary to let someone overtake through, because going side by side, even on a slower lap, you're still doing some pretty decent rates and knots around this track. So yeah, Russell and Hamilton in the 126s, Checo, Max in the 127s. Piastri was much faster, but probably on a different type of fuel load. So Leclerc finished the session a 121.9, which was rapid, 4 tenths up on Lando, 4 tenths up on Oscar, faster than anyone by a mile. Yuki was here though in the mix, and fair play to Valtteri Bottas today, who put in a stellar performance, honestly. P6 in practice, and then backed it up in qualifying as well. And then Ferrari decided, you know what, we're going to use this floor. We're not just going to call it experimental, we're running it on the car for the qualifying session, and immediately things seemed a little bit different. Sprint quali is always strange, because you're using one set of mediums in SQ1 and SQ2, and then one set of new softs for SQ3. There was a bit more deg in SQ3 than I think the team was really expecting, because you could tell that for many drivers, they weren't really pushing that hard in their opening laps on the mediums, because they knew that it was going to be fastest to do one big lap at the end where they use all their remaining rubber and when the track is mostly rubbered in. So that's generally what we were seeing here, but immediately it was quite clear. I mean, Norris, Russell pretty much neck and neck at the moment. We then saw Bottas go P4 briefly, although unfortunately for him that ended relatively swiftly afterwards, and then we saw Lando and Russell put in exactly the same lap time, a 1:22.021. For some reason Crofty didn't even mention this at the time of the broadcast, but that happened twice in this session. Two drivers with the same time down to the thousandths. And but I mean, this kind of trajectory on the left hand side was pretty similar to what we were maybe expecting to see, and Perez was nowhere in the early part of practice, and that continued here again. So Perez's fastest lap after Lando puts in a 1:21.3 was only a 1:22.7, and now unfortunately for Perez, he was held up to some degree by Leclerc. I believe this was on his fastest lap when Leclerc and Perez were basically racing into turn one. They both wanted the line to take their own lap on. Perez had to take a wider line and almost like defend from Leclerc in some sense, which would have cost him probably a tenth and a half, a couple of tenths of a second. I don't think it necessarily was a lap ruiner, but it certainly wasn't ideal for Perez at all. Leclerc therefore had to back out and didn't put in a great time either, and it certainly didn't help Checo. But at the same time, Checo had multiple laps to put in a better time than this, and he couldn't even get especially close in the end to where he needed to be. So another disaster class, right? I mean, in the end, Verstappen put in basically a 1:22 flat. So Perez was still 7 tenths off Max. And even with, the incident with Leclerc, he obviously will believe, and everyone knows, he could have done better. Now, there is one, I'm not going to say a saving grace at all, because this is another absolute disaster from Checo. But Yuki actually did qualify behind him. Now, he got caught up in traffic, his tyres weren't in the best window, so he'll be frustrated with that after a good practice showing. But still, he does get out qualified by one VCARB in Liam Lawson, and Lawson goes on to do a pretty good job as the session continues as well. There's even further drama on this, so this Lawson-Perez beef that was going on a couple of weeks ago, that seems to have continued. Lawson says, Perez, this guy, honestly, over the radio, and have a look at this, 13th in Singapore, 11th, 10th, 18th, 13th, 13th, and then the back-to-back 16th place places over the last couple of qualifying sessions. So, yeah, is this good enough? Not in my opinion. And I'm sure that this kind of Red Bull mechanic gives the thoughts off of many of us in Formula 1 right now watching these qualifying sessions like, oh my god, are you serious? Even this guy in the background on the right-hand side is like, oh my god, you cannot make this type of stuff up. So Perez is out. Eventually, we get into SQ2, of course. Lawson does well, actually gets into SQ3 in the end. Bottas tried his best. He didn't quite make it through. Neither of the Aston Martins did either. But already we could see here that the Ferrari wasn't in the best spot. And it was interesting that in this SQ2 session, Leclerc did, basically the same time that he did in practice. I know that was on the soft tyre. But yeah, clearly the Ferrari wasn't quite getting the tyres as they wanted to. And when SQ3 got underway, Lawson was in here. Hulkenberg got in here as well, which is big for the constructors, as did Gasly, which is also potentially big if he can score any points in tomorrow's sprint race. But Lando put in a 1:21.0, an absolutely mega lap. No one was going to be able to beat that over the course of the rest of the session. Fair play to Piastri, he very much warmed up over the course of the day, put in a good lap time to go second at the time. Hamilton, again, was a good few tenths off Russell in the end, but there were some serious deltas between car performances today. Russell puts in a great lap at the death, goes green, green, green at 600ths behind Lando, but still not good enough to get on pole position. The tyres were digging more than I think people expected. There were lots of lap times coming in that were yellow, such as Hamilton's. He ends up about a tenth of his own best lap time. Sainz puts in his only lap that he got, did a good job with it. Leclerc had a good lap as well, but actually he messed up the final corner, basically. He had a bit of big snap of oversteer actually out of the final corner, which cost him probably a tenth and a half or something, so that would have been in the mix for P3, but probably no higher than that. Verstappen ends up in P6 after another, look, he was only 3 tenths off Lando, another pretty good performance of Max, but in today's competitiveness, at least at the front, that was only enough for 6th place, whereas Perez is going to be down in P16 for tomorrow. So another sprint pole for Lando, impressive performance again. Obviously the constructors fight is still alive, that's looking very good for McLaren, but yeah, obviously we don't know what the race pace is going to look like, and tyre deg around here can be a problem. Well, not exactly tyre deg, but tyre collapse. We know that the tyres up against these curbs in Qatar can just break over time. So intrigued to your thoughts as always in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.